Certainly a disturbing trend, one with many explanations and also many theories about what's next. Elan Mui is a staff writer with The Washington Post and is here to weigh in. And Elan, I think the Wall Street Journal put it best. They said there is an increase in prices in everything from cotton to corn to copper. This is, of course, squeezing company profits. What do you think Americans should be most concerned about?
Well, I think that in America, there's some good news for us and there's some bad news for us. I think that the bad news is that certainly commodities prices could potentially drive up consumer prices here in America. You've already heard companies like Kraft say that they'll have to pass on some of the increasing costs that they're finding in some of their products. The good news for American consumers, though, is that in America, the price of any product is actually, the commodity price on any product is actually very small. A lot of what you're paying for in a loaf of bread is actually the packaging, the marketing around that bread, the distribution. So that's something that can help companies curtail prices. They have a little bit more wiggle room in America than they do in some other countries across the world.
And real briefly, I want to lay this out in terms of what Americans can understand. The price of milk could go up to $3.61 a gallon. Sugar could go up to 69 cents a pound, and eggs could go up to $1.87 a dozen. Talk to me about how some of these basic household goods, what's happening there, how that translates to what happens long term.
Well, right now, actually, we haven't seen the CPI, the Consumer Price Index, which is the national measure of inflation. It hasn't increased that much just yet. Now, if these prices do get passed on to consumers, you might see that this basket of goods goes up. What that means for consumers right now is that we're at a time when consumers are just coming out of the recession. They're trying to balance their budget. Maybe they're feeling a little bit better about their overall spending, and they can put out a little bit more. In fact, some people say that these increases are actually a sign that companies are more optimistic that the American consumer will be resilient and can absorb some of these price increases. Now, just because they increase prices doesn't mean that we're going to pay them. So there's a trade-off there between how much we're willing to pay and how much companies are willing to hold down that line.
And certainly that remains to be seen. But when we kind of look at what caused this all to happen, there are so many theories, so many factors that people point to in terms of what actually drove these prices up. In the first place, from more demand for food in countries like India to weather conditions in countries like China. But there is also this issue, and I'm sure you've covered this at least to an extent, this betting on the commodities. We talk about companies like Goldman Sachs who, bet on these companies, put money into them, even though there wasn't any difference. They were sort of driving the prices up. I'm wondering if you think, if you can predict, whether any sort of limits will be put on this type of betting by these big companies.
I think that it's really highly unlikely, because I think that the banks are not the only ones who are doing this. Certainly, governments are doing this as well. Governments are huge purchasers of commodities. You're actually finding that countries like Jordan, like Tunisia, have because they're worried about the unrest and they're worried about rising crop prices, that they're trying to hedge their bets, they're trying to lock in prices. They get nervous. That sends prices even higher. So it's not something that's limited to one sector of the commodity industry.
I want to talk about a crop that's huge here in the U.S., and that is corn. The U.S. is the largest exporter of corn, but less and less is actually being exported, and less is going into food products. And, it's not just corn, it's corn syrup, things like that. But I found something interesting, this fun fact, that the corn used to fill up a SUV 25-gallon tank one time with ethanol will feed a starving African for an entire year. Talk about this contrast in terms of where we're headed, particularly in regards to corn.
I think that our corn consumption is actually something that is a staple in America, and I think that one thing that you're seeing is that there is this increased use of corn products for biofuels as opposed to for actual consumption. I don't think that that's going to change necessarily in America. I do think, though, that one thing that we found is that the higher commodity prices have contributed to an increase in poverty across the world. The World Bank just said that in 2010, 44 million people lived in poverty because of higher food prices, and that's something that's a concern for leaders across the world.
Elan Mui, staff writer with The Washington Post, thanks so much for coming on.
Thank you.